Most discoveries are usually remembered as the result of genius, planning, and years of careful work. And many of them were. But history also has another side. There are real documented cases where important discoveries did not happen because someone was looking for them. They happened because something went wrong. An experiment was contaminated. A device behaved in a way nobody expected. A mistake was made during testing. Or someone noticed a strange detail that most people would have ignored. At the time, these moments often looked like failures, accidents, or random problems. But later, they changed medicine, technology, food, materials, and even our understanding of the universe. In this video, we're looking at discoveries that were made completely by accident. I also have a Telegram channel with more content and future video ideas. The link is in the description. Velcro, 1941. Velcro did not begin in a factory. It began after a walk. In 1941, a Swiss engineer named George de Mestral went outside with his dog. When he came back, he noticed that small burrs from plants were stuck to his clothes and to the dog's fur. Most people would have just pulled them off and thrown them away. But de Mestral became curious. He looked at the burrs closely and noticed something simple but clever. They were covered in tiny hooks. Those hooks could grab onto fabric, hair, or anything with small loops. That gave him an idea. What if a fastener could work the same way? One side would have tiny hooks. The other side would have tiny loops. Press them together, and they would stick. Pull them apart, and they would separate. It took years to develop, but that small annoyance from nature eventually became Velcro. A discovery that started with something stuck to a dog. Post-it notes, 1968. Post-it notes began with a failed glue. In 1968, a scientist at 3M named Spencer Silver was trying to create a stronger adhesive. That was the goal. A glue that could hold things tightly. But what he made was almost the opposite. It was sticky, but not too sticky. It could attach to a surface, then peel away without tearing it or leaving a mess behind. For most companies, that would have looked like a failure. A glue that does not really glue. But Silver knew there was something unusual about it. The problem was that nobody knew what to use it for. Years later, another 3M employee named Art Fry had a simple problem. He sang in a church choir, and he used small pieces of paper to mark pages in his hymnal. But the bookmarks kept falling out. Then he remembered Silver's strange adhesive. A weak glue suddenly became useful. It could hold a note in place, but still come off cleanly. And that is how one of the most common office products in the world started, with a glue that was not strong enough. Saccharin, 1879. Saccharin started with something no scientist should ever do. A chemist forgot to wash his hands. In 1879, Konstantin Fallberg was working in a laboratory at Johns Hopkins University, studying chemicals made from coal tar. After a long day in the lab, he went to eat. And then something strange happened. His food tasted sweet. Not normally sweet. Unusually sweet. At first, it did not make sense. The sweetness was not coming from the food itself. It was coming from his hands. Fallberg realized that something from the lab had stayed on his skin, and one of the chemicals he had been working with had an extremely sweet taste. That substance became known as saccharin. It had no sugar, but it tasted sweet, and over time it became one of the first artificial sweeteners used around the world. So one of the most important sugar substitutes in history began with a mistake that, today, would probably get someone yelled at in any laboratory. Stainless steel, 1913. Stainless steel was not discovered because someone wanted to make better kitchen sinks. It began with gun barrels. In 1913, in Sheffield, England, a metallurgist named Harry Burley was working on a problem for the weapons industry. Gun barrels were wearing out too quickly from heat, friction, and pressure. So Burley was testing different steel alloys, trying to find a metal that could survive harsher conditions. One of those alloys contained a lot of chromium. At first, it did not look like anything special. But then Burley noticed something strange. Most steel samples would rust, stain, or react when exposed to certain chemicals. This one did not behave the same way. It resisted corrosion. That was not what he had been looking for. He was trying to make steel that could handle gun barrels. Instead, he had found steel that could resist rust. He reportedly called it rustless steel at first. Later, it became known as stainless steel. And that accidental discovery changed far more than weapons. It changed kitchens, hospitals, tools, factories, buildings, and almost every place where strong, clean, rust-resistant metal is needed. A search for better gun barrels helped create the metal behind modern life. Vulcanized rubber, 1839. Before vulcanized rubber, natural rubber was a problem. It was useful, but unreliable. In hot weather, it could become sticky and soft. In cold weather, it could turn hard and crack. That made it difficult to use for anything that had to last. Charles Goodyear spent years trying to fix this. He experimented with different mixtures, trying to make rubber stronger, more stable, and less affected by temperature. Then, in 1839, one of those experiments changed everything. According to the famous story, Goodyear accidentally dropped a mixture of rubber and sulfur onto a hot stove. Instead of simply melting, the rubber changed. It became tougher, more elastic, and more stable. That process became known as vulcanization, named after Vulcan, the Roman god of fire. And it made rubber far more useful than it had ever been before. Over time, vulcanized rubber became important for shoes, belts, hoses, seals, machinery, and eventually tires. So one of the materials that helped build the modern world started with rubber, sulfur, heat, and an accident on a stove. Superglue, 1942. Superglue was not created because someone wanted to fix broken mugs, toys, shoes, or anything around the house. It began during World War II. In 1942, a chemist named Harry Coover was working for Eastman Kodak. His team was searching for clear plastic materials that could be used in precision gun sights. They needed something transparent, strong, and useful for the military. During that research, Coover and his team came across a group of chemicals called cyanoacrylates. But there was a problem. They were too sticky. The material bonded to almost everything it touched. It stuck to the tools, the equipment, and the surfaces around it. For the project they were working on, this made it almost useless. They were not looking for a glue. They were looking for a clear plastic. So the substance was rejected. Years later, Coover came across cyanoacrylates again while working on another project, this time involving heat-resistant materials for aircraft canopies. And once again, the same strange problem appeared. The material stuck to everything. But this time, Coover realized the problem might actually be the product. A chemical that was too sticky for one experiment could become an incredibly powerful adhesive. That accidental discovery eventually became known as superglue. It could bond surfaces quickly, strongly, and with only a tiny amount. What started as an unwanted mistake in a military research project became one of the most useful adhesives in the world. A failed plastic turned into the glue people now use to fix almost anything. Teflon, 1938. Teflon began with a gas cylinder that looked empty. In 1938, a chemist named Roy Plunkett was working for DuPont, trying to create a new refrigerant. He was not trying to make a non-stick pan. He was not thinking about frying eggs. He was working with gases used in cooling systems. One of those gases was tetrafluoroethylene. Plunkett stored it inside small pressurized cylinders. But one day, when he opened one of the cylinders, nothing came out. At first, it looked like the gas had disappeared. But that made no sense. The cylinder still had weight. Something was still inside. So Plunkett and his assistant cut the cylinder open. Inside, they found a strange white, waxy powder. The gas had changed into a solid. That material was polytetrafluoroethylene, later known by the brand name Teflon. And it had properties that were almost bizarre. It was extremely slippery. It resisted heat. It did not react easily with other chemicals. And almost nothing wanted to stick to it. At first, this was not a kitchen product. Teflon was too unusual and too difficult to make for everyday use. Its early value was in science, engineering, and industry, especially in places where a material had to survive heat, chemicals, or friction. Only later did people realize how useful it could be for cookware. A surface that food did not easily stick to could change the way people cook. That is why the story is so strange. One of the most famous non-stick materials in the world was not created because someone wanted to improve a frying pan. It came from a failed refrigerant experiment. A cylinder that seemed empty was actually hiding one of the most useful materials of the modern world. Microwave oven, 1945. The microwave oven did not begin as a kitchen appliance. It began as military radar equipment. In 1945, an engineer named Percy Spencer was working with magnetrons, powerful devices used in radar systems during World War II. These machines were not designed to cook food. They were designed to send out high-frequency electromagnetic waves that could help detect enemy aircraft. But one day, while Spencer was standing near one of them, he noticed something strange. A candy bar in his pocket had melted. At first, that sounds almost random. But Spencer understood that something nearby had caused it. The magnetron was producing microwave energy, and that energy was heating the food without fire, without a stove, and without direct contact. Most people would have probably just thrown the candy bar away and moved on. Spencer did the opposite. He started testing it. He placed popcorn near the machine, and it popped. Then he tried an egg, and the pressure built up so quickly that it exploded. That was the moment the idea became impossible to ignore. A radar device was not just detecting objects in the sky. It could heat food. The first microwave ovens were nothing like the small boxes people have in their kitchens today. Early versions were huge, expensive, and mostly used in commercial settings. But over time, the technology became smaller, cheaper, and common in homes around the world. And that is the strange part. One of the most normal kitchen appliances today started because an engineer noticed that a piece of candy had melted in his pocket. A machine built for war accidentally changed the way people cook. Synthetic purple dye/Mauveine, 1856. For most of history, purple was not just a color. It was a symbol of wealth. Real purple dye was difficult to make, expensive, and connected with royalty, power, and status. It was not the kind of color most ordinary people could easily wear. And then, in 1856, an 18-year-old chemistry student accidentally changed that. His name was William Henry Perkin. Perkin was trying to solve a completely different problem. He was attempting to make quinine, a medicine used to treat malaria. At the time, quinine was valuable and difficult to obtain naturally, so the idea of creating it artificially was extremely important. But Perkin's experiment failed. Instead of producing quinine, he ended up with a dark, messy substance that looked useless. Most people would have thrown it away. But when Perkin cleaned the material with alcohol, he noticed something unexpected. It left behind a bright purple color. And not just any purple. It was strong, beautiful, and it could dye fabric. That accidental color became known as Mauveine, or mauve. Suddenly, a color that had once been associated with wealth and royalty could be produced in a laboratory. The discovery became a fashion sensation. But its impact went far beyond clothing. Perkin's accidental purple dye helped launch the synthetic dye industry, and that industry became connected to chemistry, medicine, materials, and modern manufacturing. So a failed attempt to make malaria medicine ended up changing fashion, chemistry, and the way color was produced around the world. One failed experiment did not cure malaria, but it colored the modern world. X-rays, 1895. For most of human history, if something was wrong inside the human body, doctors had a serious problem. They could listen, they could touch, they could guess, but they could not simply look inside. A broken bone, a bullet, a hidden injury, all of it was invisible unless the body was opened. And then, in 1895, that changed because of a strange glow in a dark laboratory. The scientist was Wilhelm Röntgen, a German physicist working at the University of Würzburg. He was experimenting with a cathode ray tube, a glass tube that could produce electrical effects when air was removed from it and high voltage was applied. This was not supposed to become a medical discovery. Röntgen was studying electricity, radiation, and the behavior of invisible rays inside laboratory equipment. During one experiment, he covered the tube with black cardboard, so visible light from the tube could not escape. But then he noticed something strange. Across the room, a screen coated with a chemical began to glow. That should not have happened. The tube was covered. The light was blocked. And yet, something invisible was still traveling through the room and hitting the screen. Röntgen did not ignore it. He started testing. He placed different objects between the tube and the glowing screen. Paper did almost nothing. Wood blocked very little. Some materials let the rays pass through, but metal blocked them much more strongly. Then he noticed something even stranger. When he placed his hand in front of the screen, he could see the shadow of his bones. Not the outside of his hand, the inside. The bones appeared dark, while the softer parts of the hand were more transparent. At that moment, this was not just a physics experiment anymore. It was a way to see through the human body. Röntgen did not know exactly what these rays were, so he called them X-rays. The X meant unknown. One of the most famous early images he made was of his wife's hand. In the image, her bones were clearly visible, along with the ring on her finger. To people at the time, it must have looked almost impossible. A photograph of a living hand, but with the skeleton showing through. News of the discovery spread quickly. Doctors immediately understood what it could mean. For the first time, they could see broken bones without cutting into the body. They could locate bullets and other objects inside injured patients. They could examine the body in a way that had never been possible before. And the change happened fast. Within months, X-rays were being used in hospitals and medical offices. Of course, people did not yet understand all the dangers of radiation exposure. Early X-ray work could be risky, and safety rules had to develop over time. But the discovery itself completely changed medicine. It gave doctors a new kind of vision. And it began with a mistaken expectation. A covered tube should not have made a screen glow from across the room. But it did. And because Röntgen paid attention to something that was not supposed to happen, the invisible world inside the human body became visible for the first time. Penicillin, 1928. One of the most important medical discoveries in history began with something every laboratory tries to avoid: contamination. In 1928, Alexander Fleming was working at St. Mary's Hospital in London. He was studying bacteria, especially a dangerous type called Staphylococcus. These bacteria could cause serious infections, and at the time, doctors had very limited ways to fight them. This was before modern antibiotics. If an infection spread through the body, it could become deadly very quickly. A small wound, a cut, or an infection after surgery could turn into something doctors could not control. Then Fleming went away from his lab. And while he was gone, one of his bacterial culture plates was accidentally contaminated by mold. For most scientists, that would have been annoying. A ruined experiment. A dirty plate. Something to throw away. But when Fleming returned and looked at the plate, he noticed something strange. The mold itself was not the important part. The space around it was. Around the mold, the bacteria were gone. It was almost like the mold had created an invisible circle where the bacteria could not survive. That detail changed everything. Fleming realized that the mold was producing something that killed bacteria, or at least stopped them from growing. The mold belonged to a group called Penicillium, and the substance it produced became known as penicillin. But the discovery did not instantly become a medicine. That part is important. Fleming had found something powerful, but turning it into a usable treatment was much harder. Penicillin was difficult to isolate, difficult to purify, and difficult to produce in large amounts. For years, it remained more of a promising discovery than a practical drug. Then, in the late 1930s and early 1940s, scientists at Oxford, including Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, helped turn penicillin into something doctors could actually use. During World War II, the need for better infection treatment became urgent. Soldiers were dying not only from wounds, but from infections that followed those wounds. Penicillin changed that. It became one of the first truly effective antibiotics, and it transformed medicine. Infections that had once been terrifying became treatable. Surgery became safer. Wounds became less deadly. Diseases that had killed people for centuries could suddenly be fought with a drug. And all of it began with a contaminated plate that most people would have cleaned up and forgotten. That is what makes the story so strange. The accident did not save lives by itself. Fleming still had to notice it. Other scientists still had to develop it. Factories still had to produce it. But the first clue was sitting in a dirty dish. A failed experiment became one of the most important medicines ever discovered. Cosmic microwave background radiation, 1964. For years, two scientists thought their antenna was broken. No matter where they pointed it, no matter how carefully they checked the equipment, it kept picking up the same strange noise. A quiet hiss. It came from every direction in the sky. It did not behave like normal interference. It did not seem to come from Earth, from the atmosphere, or from any single object in space. And the stranger part is that they were not looking for anything like this. In the 1960s, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson were working at Bell Labs in New Jersey, using a large horn-shaped radio antenna that had originally been built for satellite communication experiments. Their job was to make precise radio measurements, but the antenna kept detecting a background signal they could not explain. At first, they treated it like a technical problem. Maybe the electronics were creating noise. Maybe the antenna was dirty. Maybe something nearby was interfering with the measurements. They checked the equipment. They tested the instruments. They looked for anything that could be causing the unwanted signal. There were even pigeons living inside the antenna. The birds had left droppings inside it, so Penzias and Wilson cleaned the antenna carefully, thinking that maybe this was part of the problem. But the noise did not disappear. The same faint signal was still there, coming from everywhere. That was what made it so important. Most interference has a source. It comes from a place. But this signal seemed to fill the sky. Around the same time, scientists at Princeton University were thinking about a prediction connected to the Big Bang. If the universe had once been extremely hot and dense, then some leftover radiation from that early period should still exist. Not visible light. Not something people could see with their eyes. But a faint microwave glow, stretched across the entire universe. A kind of leftover heat from the beginning of everything. Penzias and Wilson had not been trying to find it, but their antenna had picked it up. That signal became known as the cosmic microwave background radiation. It is often described as the afterglow of the Big Bang. Not the Big Bang itself. Not an explosion happening somewhere in space. But old radiation from the early universe, stretched over billions of years into microwave wavelengths. Before this discovery, the Big Bang was one major explanation for the universe, but it was still competing with other ideas. After this signal was found, the evidence became much stronger. The universe had not always looked the way it looks today. It had changed. It had expanded. It had once been much hotter, denser, and younger. And one of the strongest pieces of evidence for that was discovered because two scientists could not get rid of a strange noise. They thought something was wrong with their antenna. Instead, they were listening to the oldest light in the universe. A quiet microwave echo that had been traveling for billions of years. Background noise that turned out to be the universe telling its own story. And those were some of the discoveries that were made by accident. Some started with a failed experiment. Some started with a strange mistake, and some looked like ordinary problems that most people would have ignored. But because someone noticed the detail, asked the right question, or looked a little closer, those accidents became part of history. They changed food, medicine, materials, technology, and even the way we understand the universe. I also have a Telegram channel where I share more stories, future video ideas, and extra content. If you're interested, you're welcome to join. The link is in the description. Until next time.